I brought props. You might wonder about that. Throw all the tomatoes you want, but if you want to do them in the Q&A, I'd appreciate it. I'm a storyteller. I'm not here to tell anybody what to do, except maybe for Leif and you. I'm the oldest guy here, and so I have more experience than anybody else, especially in terms of libertarianism and objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. So I'd like to start. Do I need a microphone? Yes. So I'd like to start in 1954. Leif may actually remember this. He's a few years older than me. One day we were lined up in the hallway and we all got the Salk vaccine. Polio was tearing its way around the world, and it was delivering crippling diseases, death, iron lungs. Families were terrified. Little kids like me were not allowed to go out and play when polio was around. It was that frightening. Now, if you know the history of vaccinations, Salk created a live serum vaccine, the first one of its kinds. And another scientist, and actually an academic by the name of Sabin, said, just wait 3 years for my dead virus vaccine, it'll be much safer. And he was right. There was one batch of Salk vaccine that wasn't produced properly, and it gave polio to a bunch of kids. But it saved tens of thousands of lives. There was a trade-off there between the risk of an untested process that had never been done before, certainly not in the vaccine business, which had been around for a couple of 100 years since smallpox vaccine was developed. That took a risk. And 3 years later, it was converted to the Sabin vaccine when it was approved. And we all got the little sugar cubes later on in life. Maybe some of you have actually had that. Cycle forward 10 years. So I was 8 years old back then. I'm 18. I'm about to come to Colorado. I'm going to become a geologist. And I'm already a little nerd scientist by the time I'm 10. I research everything. I'm an embarrassment to my family because I come to the table with facts, not just with opinions, not just with logic and reason. My dad was an engineer. Or models that may or may not really work. No, I'm a fact-based little kid, right? And so what do? I realize that there's a problem in the mountains of Colorado called Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And if I'm going to become a geologist, I'm going to spend every moment I can out in the woods, sleeping on the ground, maybe getting ticks, and I did, where I can't describe it because there are women in the audience, and I'm going to figure out what to do. And turns out that I had a girlfriend whose father was a doctor, and I got the Rocky Mountain spotted fever vaccinations. 3 years later, I'm spending 3 months between the Poudre River at Rustic and Red Feather Lakes. And right south of there is the Colorado State University mountain campus, which has a big forestry program. And I was covered in ticks that year. I had a tweezers to pull the damn things off. Not a good thing to do. And I never got spotted fever. But several forestry students got spotted fever that they damn near died from. They lost their summer's work. They lost an entire year. They couldn't graduate the next year. The consequences of not thinking it through in advance caused them a lot of grief. Cycle forward again. Now we're in the late 90s, and I'm getting ready to liquidate all of my business assets. I've decided that I'm going to switch from oil and gas geology to private lands and community-based conservation work, and I'm going to Africa, Why? Because in the US, we can write really, really bad environmental laws, but we're so damn rich, we can still have some success even though we're throwing billions of dollars away. In Africa, they can't do that. They're too damn poor. That was the talk I gave last time. I'll move on immediately. So I'm getting ready to go to Africa, and what do? I read a 1,000-page history. I study animal behavior. I discover everything I need to know to protect myself when I'm working in the field, just like I did when I was a geologist. And if you don't think it's actually important to know what you're doing, there was an incident a few years ago in a park in South Africa that is like Lion Country Safari. Anybody seen that in Florida, where you drive in a vehicle and they have these little fenced out areas and there's elephants in this fence and there's other animals in that fencing? And she was in a vehicle and there was a giant sign and it said, "Keep your windows rolled up, you're going into the lion enclosure." And she didn't do it. She was 22 years old and she lived another 15 minutes. By not thinking through what you're doing, you can lose your life. You're looking at somebody who has crashed in helicopters and walked away. My motto in life is better lucky than smart. I mean, I do a lot of really, really adventurous things, and it sounds like I'm taking a lot of risks. But in fact, before I ever planted my feet on African soil, I knew what was going to do me harm. And I don't mean rhinos, which the title of my book meant that I had to be able to prove that I could climb a tree. So I learned as much as I could. One of the first things I did was go to the CDC website. This would have been 1997, somewhere about that, around there. And remember, I'm like you guys, I'm a libertarian. And so I get on this website, and I am convinced that it is not determined to give information to travelers. It is designed to scare the living shit out of everybody. Do you mind if I swear?
No, please swear.
It is designed to scare the living shit out of everybody. I just went back on the website because I'm going to give this talk just a week or two ago. It's a little bit better, but it still misses a whole lot of the most important stuff. So one of the most dangerous things about going to Africa is the potential for malaria. 2 years ago, malaria killed 800,000 people in Africa. That's how many people supposedly. And we're not going to argue about whether they died from COVID or not, because we're going to agree on this stuff, right? You know, if you were on a ventilator and you were 98 years old and you died and you had the infection, did you really die of COVID? I don't want to get into that. I want to get into why I've taken so many vaccines and protected myself from so many different diseases. So there's no vaccine for malaria. Malaria is carried by mosquitoes, Anopheles. And it's a parasite. It is not a virus. P. falciparum. So I go and I read up on it, and they tell you to take a prophylaxis. But I'm going there to work. I'm not going for 2 weeks. I'm going there for as much as 6 or 8 weeks at a time. Very bad thing to do. The longer you take a prophylaxis, the chances are you're going to get a strain of malaria that is resistant to the prophylaxis. And now you're not just going to get sick, you're going to get totally screwed. So I go to Africa, and what do my friends in Africa who work there say? Don't ever take prophylaxis, number one. And they bought me this stuff. What does that say? Coartem. It's a combination of a Chinese herbal medicine and an anti-parasitical. Artemether was developed by the Chinese out of Chinese medicine in 1984, and it kills the parasite if you take it as soon as you break with the fever, with virtually no side effects if you've got something else. And so I carry that stuff in my medical kit. Why would anybody carry 3 of these? Because if somebody else breaks with malaria, like one of the Africans that I'm working with, I feed it to him. And I make sure he takes the whole damn course of the medicine, and it cures malaria. Again, go on the CDC website and look for coartem.
Probably not there.
Why not? If you hate the CDC, let's go back to the FDA. Why hasn't the FDA approved coartem? Because malaria is not endemic to the US. It's as simple as that. It's nuts. That stuff is made by Big Pharma, by Novartis. And I wouldn't go anywhere, Asia or Africa, without carrying that along. So, you work in Africa, and I knew that I would be sleeping on the ground in national parks and other protected areas, right? And you work in the field, and it's very hot, and it's sweaty, and you sit around a campfire, and you eat bush dinners, and after a while, you want to take a bath, right? Do you go down to the lake and take a swim and bathe? Why not?
That's where the mosquitoes are?
No. In the water, in standing water, is schistosoma, which is a little worm that comes in through your butthole and goes out through your eyeballs. It's called river blindness. And if that doesn't get you, crocodiles will. And I'm not making that up. Crocodiles will sit on the bottom until you walk by the shore, and they'll come right out and they'll get you. I know one little pond where 5 natives who were washing clothes were killed in 2 weeks' time. It is really, so you be careful, right? So what did I do? I studied large animal behavior, I studied small animal behavior. I knew very important things about how to survive. For instance, if you're charged by a rhino, you go up a tree. I mean, literally, I was treed many times. You go up a tree. You don't wait around to see if they're going to change their minds. You go up a tree. If you're charged by an elephant, do you go up a tree? No. If an elephant is so pissed off at you that he really means to kill you, he'll take the tree down. I've watched, Jackie, do we see him take down very large trees?
Yes, dear.
She's my shill. She's my shill, okay. Yeah, so different behaviors require different responses. And so I have, in my yellow card, anybody here travel to Africa, Asia? You went on safari?
No. I've been to Northern Africa just for fun.
Well, you know, Northern Africa is where sickle cell developed. It's an evolutionary response to malaria, where if you have one gene, you don't get malaria. And if you have 2 genes, you get sickle cell, and that's just about does you in. And if you have no genes, you get malaria. If you get 2 genes, you get sickle cell. So if you have 1 gene, it saves you from malaria. You don't get malaria. It's one of those evolutionary responses to parasites. I just introduced Leif to a book called The Red Queen by Matt Ridley, which is about why there are 2 sexes, the dance between predator and prey. And the other one is The Hot Zone by Preston. Thank you. I thought it was from Ridley, and it's by Preston, which is an outbreak of Ebola in a monkey house in Reston, Virginia. Anybody see the movie Outbreak? Dustin Hoffman? It was anti-government, so you should have liked it. They're going to drop a bomb on this town because this airborne disease was killing people, bleeding them out like that, just like Ebola. In fact, Ebola went airborne in Reston, Virginia, in the monkey house. They knew it because there were separate rooms, only air conditioning and heating vents traveling between them, and Ebola is bloodborne. It doesn't travel through the air. And all of a sudden, this thing traveled through the air, and whatever higher powers you may believe in, it only has 7 genes. It's a little mRNA. That's all it is. It's a messenger RNA with 7 genes on it, wrapped in a little protein sheath. And when it gets inside your cells, it replicates until it bursts the cells. That's why you bleed out so fast with Ebola. And this damn thing, when it went airborne, also went benign for human beings. It is just an accident of fate that saved us from something like COVID, only with a 60% mortality rate. You talk about hospitals being overwhelmed. You saw what happened with Ebola, with people coming back from Liberia. It took one person in a hospital, overwhelm a hospital. This thing might have, when it went airborne, could have wiped out a large fraction of the human population very quickly. It didn't. We were very lucky. So before I went to Africa, I got typhoid, tetanus, yellow fever. I was working in countries with endemic yellow fever. You can't even travel without your yellow card and your yellow fever certificate. And all the rest of them. And so when this thing came along, I went into research mode. So we were in Palau in January of 2020. We were scuba divers, and we go to very remote places in the world. Indonesia, Fiji. We could have been right swimming next to that volcano that just blew up in Tonga. In fact, we've been in Fiji when we swam through rafts of pumice diving because that same volcano blew up, 2004. And we, God, I've lost that train of thought for a second there. We were in Palau, and we dive with a group of friends. We trust each other. We don't trust strangers. Diving is dangerous. And we always go to a resort a couple of days in advance, and we stay a couple of days after, and we get on a boat, and we sail away for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. In this case, it was 2 weeks. The resort was full of Asians, 80% Chinese and Japanese, mostly Chinese tourists. 2 weeks later, we get off the boat, we walk back to the resort. It's morning, and there's nobody around. So my nickname for myself is Weasel Warner. I'm always looking for a good deal. So I go up to the receptionist, she knew me, and I said, can we get an upgrade to the pool, right, for our entire group? And she said, we're fully booked. And I said, we'll be drinking Mai Tais at the pool. And 2 hours later, she comes over, and she says, we've upgraded you to suites around the pool. I said, what happened? She said, we have had 100% cancellation. War between China and the US, I mean, who knows? I said, what's going on? She said, there's this strange disease and airlines are canceling their flights. And so 2 days later, we're sitting in Narita with an 8-hour layover. We just barely got back to the US. This is February of 2020. We just barely got back. But I know a lot about viruses, and I know a lot about other aspects of biology, and so I immediately went online. I had an 8-hour layover. I might as well do something, right? I immediately recognized that it was probably, when they said COVID or coronavirus, it was bats. There are 4 strains of coronaviruses. Bats are the viral transmitters of the mammal world. They carry a bigger viral load than any other creature alive. And think of how bats live, right? They hang together as if, that was a joke. I didn't mean to say that. They hang together upside down, as it were, right? And they carry huge amounts of virus. And then I immediately thought, oh my God, I've been in the wet markets. So I'm not a normal tourist. Normal tourists do not go to those places. I've seen dogs sold in wet markets. I've seen bats. I've seen pangolins. I've seen all kinds of animals eaten by human beings. I like the markets because of the big piles of vegetables and peppers, and then what? and I like to go in the fish markets and see if there are any rare fishes, because I know a lot of fish species, because I've been diving and working with marine biologists for a long time. And in this case, I immediately thought the Wuhan wet market, as soon as they said Wuhan, that this is a place where this could have gotten started. Whether it did or not, I knew that I would then be following day by day the progress of this. And when I saw that Moderna, which was working on cures for cancer using messenger messenger RNA, had all immediately switched to attempt to make a vaccine with this technology. To me, it was just like Jonas Salk. This is just my opinion, but I believe that if it wasn't for Donald Trump, we still wouldn't have a vaccine. Donald Trump set out at the beginning of his administration to crush the agencies because of their overbearing bureaucracies and regulations. He did it with the EPA, he did it with the FDA. The Biden administration has still not officially confirmed any of these vaccines. And it's not because it can't be done. It's because it's now a Democratic administration. They're back to the old bureaucracies again. They're going to take 5 years to get through this. But because of Donald Trump and the force that he applied to these agencies, they short-circuited this. And they shortcut a process that had taken, since the Sabin vaccine, it took 5 years to get a vaccine through. Vaccines are not made by Big Pharma because there's no money in it. They'd much rather sell you a statin that you have to take the rest of your life that costs next to nothing to manufacture. I'm not a fan of Big Pharma either, necessarily. But in this case, I think they did a spectacular job. Now, we could sit here and argue all night long. Should we have allowed this to burn through the population? Would we have gotten to Omicron faster? And I think there's an argument for that. Does everybody know what Omicron has done? Viruses do not want to kill their host. It's a bad policy for a parasite to kill its host, especially if you kill your host fast enough that it can't spread the damn disease. So in something that is bloodborne, you can't kill your host. You've got to allow the mosquito to bite the next person to pass it on. If it's infectious, not contagious, infectious off of surfaces, it takes longer to spread. And so a virus would rather morph from infectious to contagious and from less deadly, from more deadly to less deadly. That's its environmental path. It's evolutionary path. That's what they do. And that's what COVID has now done. I believe Omicron's going to save us. It may not, but I think it is likely to, because everybody I know that I've called who has gotten Omicron has gotten something like a cross between a mild cold and a mild case of the flu. And I don't know about you, but I've seen people with malaria with 104 fever. You know, I've seen people where their brains swell up and it kills them. You know, this is a really bad disease. If malaria would only calm down and just make people mildly sick, everybody could get it. Wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. So that's my story. I'm a world traveler, and I have worked in the most dangerous places, crashed twice in helicopters, walked away both times. I'm telling you, I'm not smart. I'm really lucky. Okay, a little bit smart too. And I protect myself from everything I can get my hands on. This is a really good one. If you go to any place like a tropical jungle, this is called Cipro. It's one of the older antibiotics. Now, if you're really risk averse, you can find out that there is a rare side effect that causes your Achilles tendons to weaken. But I can tell you that this is 500 milligram. Break these in half, take them 4 hours apart, and in one day, you no longer have Montezuma's revenge. I mean, it fixes you almost immediately. If you get sepsis, 4 of these a day, 500 milligrams for 5 days, and I've watched infections, not to get totally disgustingly gross, but I mean incredible pockets of pus literally disappear in 5 days. And if you happen to be working in an area where there's an outbreak of anthrax, this will cure it. So I don't leave home without this. And I worked in an anthrax area, by the way. Scary as hell. Anthrax is bad stuff. You know, just don't eat any dead animals that are laying on the ground. Pressure bandages. You getting the point here? I've got every kind of medicine. When I first went to Africa, doctors said to me, you got to get Hep B, which is a bloodborne virus. I'd gotten Hep A, and Jackie and I had gotten the entire course so that it was permanent. My joke was that this way we could eat in restaurants in Denver. Remember the Hep A outbreak? Leif is old enough to remember that. Anybody else? 20 years ago? It was about 20 years ago we had a Hep A outbreak here. It's bad for you. You can kill your liver. It's not a good thing to get, right? But my doctor said, you should get Hep B. And I said, it's bloodborne. He said, yes. I said, I'm not afraid of Hep B. I'm afraid of AIDS. So what do I carry with me? Hypodermics and phlebotomy needles. I carry everything with me. Because if you're in an African hospital where they don't have the kind of control, right, you don't use their needles. Never ever, right? So you're talking about somebody who takes ridiculous risks, but also protects himself. And that's why I've had 3 Moderna shots. Questions?
So I just wanted to go back to you talking about the risks. So you started this topic talking about polio and how it was ruining people, tens of thousands. First of all, when they released the vaccine, you said that when the live vaccine was made available, you knew the risks. So
there was an argument between Sabin and Salk.
Yes.
About the risks. I was 8 years old. I didn't know the risks.
So maybe not you in particular, but at least the public was made aware that if they should wait a little bit longer, there's the risk of potentially developing polio. But
not a chance of that happening. Oh no, we were lined up and I was part of the research group. Must have been 1 million kids who got the Salk vaccine as the research test group.
No, but it's okay. I appreciate it because I am trying to understand that point more fully. Okay, so you're saying that wasn't well known, but yet you still advocate for the way that it was released. So even though you, an 8-year-old, didn't know the risks that were being taken, it could have given you polio, even though maybe you could have been more risk averse and not gone out and played with other kids or whatever. But you still condone the way that Big Pharma released that vaccine and put you in a research group without true consent.
The consent came from my parents. I was 8 years old. I couldn't give consent if I wanted to. They didn't know either. It's a point, yes, but it's not a good point because approximately 200 kids got polio from one bad batch, but tens of thousands didn't die. And the vaccine went worldwide. It knocked polio on its ear, even before the safer Sabin vaccine came out 3 years later.
But again, you're saying one bad batch. So
Yep.
We're seeing consistent issues with the COVID vaccines, that people are having heart problems, that people with asthma are having adverse effects. Overweight people are constantly having issues with these as well. So the actual risk of polio was very high. So I agree with you with vaccines, just so you know, like I'm not anti-vax. I believe that the vaccines that actually stop a virus or a parasite or whatever in its tracks are fabulous. This is completely different. They don't know what the long-term effects are. They don't know how it's affecting people. Pfizer's come out and said that they won't release the safety information for 50 years. If you ask for a pamphlet in like Like with this medicine, I'm sure that it will tell you what the side effects are. You are not, that information's not publicly available right now. And you're also saying that like, oh, you know, they have no vested interest in selling you a vaccine, and yet they're releasing what's been being called Pfizer-Mectin, which, because ivermectin has been told by a lot of people that they can cure their illness or at least make it less bad, the symptoms, sorry. But meanwhile, Pfizer has released essentially a spin-off of ivermectin so that they can sell more and make more, and they're also mandating it. So I guess I'm just trying to understand, as a libertarian, the whole idea is for consent, is for people to have the individual right to choose things for themselves. So how can you also be a proponent of getting a vaccine that you can't consent for and all of the negative side effects that can come with it?
You're talking about polio now. You're still talking about polio?
I'm talking about all of them. Like, whether it's polio or COVID, if you're mandating that children get these vaccines, specifically COVID, it was a mandate. Polio, there was also somewhat of a mandate because you had to get the vaccine to go back to school. Mm-hmm. How can you advocate that that's a better system? That you should, despite not knowing what the side effects could be, like I'm pregnant and I'm being told that I'm going to kill my child if I don't get the COVID vaccine, even though there's no information about how that could affect me. Like, we weren't even supposed to take Tylenol when you're pregnant, and now they're telling me that if I don't take it, I'm basically making a bad choice as a parent. Absolutely not. But I just don't understand.
Okay, so there's a lot of stuff in here. This is a very mixed thing that you're talking about. First off, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of so-called cures, and as soon as there's some kind of research done, it doesn't turn out to be nearly as effective as what was claimed. Also, nobody has forced us to take this vaccine. When you say that somebody is making you feel bad, well, you're a libertarian. You can tell them to drop dead. You know, you don't have to say, oh, because you made me feel bad and I might be harming my baby by not getting the vaccine or getting the vaccine one way or the other. You're still an independent person. Make up your own mind. I've told you what I did. I made up my own mind, right? Is there evidence that there are side effects? There are. In every single medication that has ever come out, there are some kinds of side effects. In fact, this one has the least side effects of any really, really super effective medication that I've ever seen. It's amazing. And yet, the FDA doesn't even approve it. So what is that about? As I said, it's not endemic malaria, and so we don't have to bother with it. The process that I'm talking about, and it's very difficult. I'm a scientist, and I can read every kind of scientific paper. In fact, I've published a paper on virology with the CDC, and I'm not a virologist. I'm a lunatic. You know why I published that paper? Because I could. You know why I jumped out of helicopters that couldn't land? Because I could. So I'm not telling you what to do, but be careful about the information out there. Number one, if it's anecdotal, watch out for it. So when you see something in the press that says, this anti-vaxxer got COVID and died, screw that, that's anecdotal. That is not science. That's pressuring people, right, with anecdotal information. But the anti-vax side does the same thing. It's going around and around and around. And so I think that in the long run, we're going to look at these numbers and we're going to see really, really interesting things that are happening. Among other things is that even the Moderna shots are not very effective against Omicron of preventing the disease. But it's very, very successful against very, very bad disease.
I
Please do.
wait, no. Keep your mic. We've got more.
All right. So I'd have to say I disagree with everything that I know about that you've said so far. Things that I don't know about, I'll have to look into that myself. But there's so many things to start with. As far as the polio epidemic goes, I mean, there is information out there, which maybe you were aware of, you don't, that, or that you're not, is that was another manufactured epidemic. So the definition for polio, we think of it as defined as, you know, iron lungs and all that. But there's a whole range of types of paralysis you can get to get a polio definition that you have. So they could define polio strictly and have few cases, or they could define it broadly and have a lot of cases. So that could be timed with the delivery of the vaccine. And that is the information that you would have to know about. You'd have to look up the history of polio and see, you know, the graphs of when the vaccine was delivered, how it was defined, and what happened to those people. A sidelight on that is that, so when the polio vaccine came out, they didn't see RNA viruses. They were invisible. RNA viruses weren't discovered till late 1970s, 1980.
Get to a question.
Oh, I'm not asking a question. I'm delivering my counter.
Just go ahead and make the point.
I'm just making a point. Let me just make this last point. If the polio vaccine, because let me ask you this. Are you aware that the polio vaccine was made from the livers of monkeys, and that those monkeys had they had simian immunovirus at that time? They made them, or it was either monkeys' livers or kidneys. So, and they found out that those kidneys or livers were infected with SIV, simian immunovirus, and that if the polio virus actually carried RNA viruses, our vaccine, we would not have known that. It would have been invisible. The hubris of injecting something into somebody when they don't even know, they haven't even seen RNA yet. In other words, everyone who took that shot could have gotten HIV, SIV, HIV, and only 30 or 40 years later, because that was what the projection was for HIV, that you would live 30 years with it, and we could still be suffering from it and not know it.
I got a loud voice. I can say a good point. A good point. On the other hand, there's a lot of hindsight in what you said. There's a lot of hindsight in what you said, and hindsight is a great thing. Unfortunately, it's a poor way of doing science. Having hindsight does not ameliorate the fact that tens of thousands of kids were saved from polio by the Salk vaccine. And if it did carry SIV, which is a conjecture, nobody got HIV from it. And so it's an interesting argument. On the other hand, yellow fever, typhoid, tetanus, rabies, cholera. I've had virtually all of them. I haven't had rabies because I don't have to get rabies. But everything else I've gotten. And I think that it's likely protected me from very dangerous diseases.
And what is your name again?
George.
George. Hi, George. I'm Jackie. And oh, you're not
Ed.
All right, Ed. Don't be a smartass. Okay. So I agree with you that a little bit of what will ail you, what will ail you will heal you, and that's the science that's behind vaccines. It's really called homeopathy. The science of homeopathy is a little bit of what will ail you, will teach the immune system to protect against, and will keep you healthy. That's why I think when a lot of us were young, some of us are younger, but children were actually exposed to chicken pox because it didn't really, there is always risk. But the idea is if you can build that immunity when you're young, you'll have that immune system, a very strong immune system when you're older. So I'm going to take you back a few hundred years. So you know Louis Pasteur. So he
Not personally.
So he was
I'm not that old.
He was the guy who said germ theory is the problem. A counterpart to him, Beauchamp, said no, it's terrain theory. Keep yourself healthy and strong. That's what's going to protect you because we have viruses, we have bacteria, we have parasites, we have fungus everywhere, all over the world. And so no one disagrees. I don't think there's an anti-vaxxer out there that would disagree that a little bit of what ails you will heal you. The problem is what's in the vaccines, even a lot of these vaccines that you're mentioning are full of adjuvants. They put mercury, they put aluminum, they put things that will alert the immune system. And if somebody is not able to manage that, there can be a lot of harm done. Furthermore, the mRNA is not a vaccine. It's a gene therapy. It is brand new. Moderna has never, ever, in the 10 to 20 years it was functioning, came up with anything that ever did anything about healing. It didn't heal cancer. They've never been successful. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't maybe a technology that could be useful, but this is a brand new science with nothing ever proven against something that is virulent, but proving to be, as the variants present, to be very harmless. And you could argue all day long about the people who have died from COVID, but most of them, 94% I think is what it is, have had comorbidities. So did they die of COVID or with COVID? And there's a lot of debate about whether or not we needed a shot that was brand new, that's never been proven, against something that, as it turns out, has morphed into something that actually is not harmful for 99.9% of the people that get afflicted. So I agree with you that the Omicron's going to save us because we're all going to get it. We're all going to be exposed to it. Some people will get it. They'll never even know they had anything. They'll build the antibodies and we'll move on. But there are quite a few virologists, vaccinologists, real experts in this field who talk about antibody-dependent enhancement. Have you heard of that? Okay. So as you force, you're right, a virus will survive. A virus comes in, it's not alive. What it is, it's an mRNA that comes in and through the ACE2 inhibitor process will usurp the DNA, replicates, and that replication, the white blood cells come in, they eradicate.
You gotta wrap it up with a question. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, so I guess
I like her talk.
I'm
It's as good as
trying
mine.
to just give some background as to why we don't need this shot and why it's risky because we don't know enough about it. And when you say people aren't being forced, and I don't really have a question, I really just wanted to comment, so I hope that's okay. But we are being forced.
Too late.
People are actually being told they can't work. The Supreme Court just said that if you're a medical provider and you're receiving government funding, Medicare or Medicaid, you are not allowed to work in this country without the shot. So that it is being mandated, it is being forced, and you are very right, young lady. You are so unlikely to be harmed by Omicron, or any of it actually, because you're young and you're very healthy and you probably have a wonderful immune system, and you do not want to take something that you do not know the outcome when there are very proven side effects. So I just wanted to kind of give that history of where this has come from and what it is.
That wasn't a question.
Wait. We got an order. You keep your mic always.
I'm trying to get rid of it.
Dias is next, then Josh, then JD.
Check. Okay, so I got a couple questions for you. One, what do you make of Geert Vanden Bosch and other renowned scientists, their argument that widespread vaccination in the middle of a pandemic actually puts evolutionary pressure on the virus to become more dangerous than it otherwise would be? And second, this seems to be less of an appeal to convince people to take the COVID vaccine and more for vaccines in general. Do you think it's possible that this paradigm has crossed over from objective science into the realm of religion? Take measles, for instance. There have been some studies that suggest that childhood measles actually helps to prevent some cardiovascular disease. So if you do have measles when you're young, it's associated with lower risks of mortality from atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Your thoughts on that?
I got lots of.
Die again?
I got lots of thoughts on that.
Oh, can you use the mic?
No.
They're great. I want to send this. Hold on.
It died again. Look. Thank you. There's evidence that.
Ed, here, come back here. We'll have you get on the wired one. Can you guys hear me back there?
All right, this one works now.
All right, sorry about that. Well, here, we're going to pass this one around.
Right on. Look, there's a lot of interesting things that are going on in terms of allopathic medicine that we all can comment about. A rise in asthma because Americans are too damn clean, and because we have not been exposed to childhood diseases that did create, beyond the immunity to that particular virus or bacteria or parasite, had other immune effects that gave us more immunity. Comorbidity, absolutely. You know, I don't see a lot of obese people hanging out here. You people take care of yourself. We should have been doing that long before COVID came along. We should have been allowing people to promote through advertising for really unhealthy foods. We can get into a lot of topics. And I think we'd probably agree on most of them. Okay, you and I will not agree on anything. We agree that we won't agree on anything. I was in Africa, right? Jackie was with me. And I was at a safari lodge that was closed. I was using it for work that I was doing. Just a 2-minute story. And I broke with 104 fever. It was a fantastic experience. When our friends came searching for us, they discovered me under a mosquito net, 104 plus. Jackie was reading to me. There was a pride of lions 100 yards away screaming their heads off. There was a thunderstorm going at the same time. It was absolutely fantastic. I loved it. I was having psychedelic experiences under that fever. I had chikungunya. Anybody heard of that? It's actually hit South America recently. It's Swahili for man who walks stiffly. It attacks your joints. You get a hemorrhagic fever. I did not have one of the Crimean hemorrhagic fevers that would have killed me. In fact, a 0 death rate out of this. I am now completely immune to this thing for the rest of my life. You know, I could have had malaria. And so as soon as my friends saw that fever, they stuffed me full of anti-malarials, which had no side effects, did not do me any harm, right? But if I had had malaria, it would have saved my life, because malaria kills people who don't treat it with the respect it deserves. Okay, Josh, is that enough? We done?
We have about 7 more people that want to ask questions.
Oh,
so
okay.
if you have time, we'll keep going.
Oh, I'm good.
Speaking of which, I'm the next question. So Ed, thank you for coming out. I appreciate you coming and giving this talk in front of a somewhat hostile audience. So my question is, how can you support these vaccines when their efficacy is absolute garbage? They don't work at all for preventing COVID. They have massive side effects that are being underreported to dramatic effect. We could look at something like VAERS. The deaths for 2021 were about 22,000, which is more deaths from all vaccines in the history of VAERS combined. And then the side effects are something like 600,000, all attributed to VAERS. If you look at something like the Lazarus report, which shows that that number is undercounted, potentially by a factor of 100. So that those numbers that I just gave you could be 100 times higher in reality. Secondly, we've been lied to about everyone since day one. Fauci, Rachel Maddow, everyone in the CDC told us that this vaccine would stop COVID. It absolutely doesn't do that. We're seeing that at record rates now. With Omicron, now obviously that's been a mutation, we're at 1,000% higher than previous highs. So where we were at a year ago, we are 1,000% higher all over the world. You look at Vermont, some of the highest vaccinated populations, as well as Gibraltar. 100% vaccination in Gibraltar. Many people have had booster shots, and they have record high rates of COVID. And this is not unique. We see this everywhere. You can almost trace a direct correlation with the amount of people who are vaccinated and the amount of COVID cases that rise. So, given all that, what do you think?
That was not a question again. That was a little speech. VAERS does not give you cause of death. Those numbers are conflated. You cannot use VAERS to claim what you just claimed. So I'm throwing that one right out the window.
Okay, hold on. I got to push back, though.
Nope, you don't get to, I get to answer.
That was my main question. So I just want to say,
Okay.
if VAERS is the primary system put in place by the government to detect negative outcomes by vaccines. So if we just dismiss VAERS, that means there is no method to know how these vaccines negatively affect people. Secondly, VAERS is known to be relatively accurate. You can also look at Australia. Australia has similar numbers.
The vaccine has been effective. It may not stop the disease completely, but it has reduced the morbidity tremendously. And you can disagree with that or not, but the people who died early on were the oldest people who already had comorbidities and should never have been counted. The confidence I have is that before I go up in a helicopter, I make sure the tank is filled. There are things that you do in it. What's that? Only twice. Only twice out of 1,000 flights. Come on, that's pretty good. Yeah. Yellow fever. I mean, there are vaccines that I would not travel to places in the world without having those vaccines. Are there side effects? Yes. Oh, listen.
Okay. Sorry, we're gonna move on to other questions.
Just one thing that was said. mRNA vaccines. Don't use it. Johnson & Johnson is a dead virus vaccine. So is AstraZeneca. If you don't like the mRNA and you have worries about it, more power to you. But there's another vaccine out there that is the standard type of vaccine that has been done. J&J is not an mRNA.
Let's keep it on the mic, you guys, or else
All right.
we're all night.
So I actually have a question for you. So I like the idea of studying things as much as you can. I think at the end of 2020, it was pretty clear that there was a lot of misinformation and government wasn't giving us the right information or protecting it. Now you also have all these different statistical things you can look at online. And I mean, I guess my question is now, given the fact you can pull up data about Australia and Israel and whatnot, would you still take the next booster? And like, which booster number are you going to stop taking?
I'd actually rather get Omicron. So I think there's really interesting data starting to come out that if you've gotten vaccinated and you get Omicron, you get super immunity. And it still may not last. That's the thing. We may be getting a COVID combined with flu vaccines in the future. You may not want to ever take another flu vaccine, or maybe you can get it separated. But these things are coming. And malaria vaccine is coming. And these are all new technologies. You know what? It's not a good question because it's the future. And as I watch this develop, then I'll make the decision of whether or not I'm going to take another vaccine. I was getting ready to get a yellow fever for the third time. And science, by the way, still is working out there. And they discovered that you didn't need it every 10 years. There was enough evidence to show you had immunity for life. And I didn't need that one. Right? I would have gotten it anyhow because you don't go into a yellow fever area. It's too damn dangerous. So yeah, the answer is, I'm a scientist. I don't know. That's the future.
Okay, so from what I understand, these vaccines are supposed to minimize the symptoms of COVID, but they don't prevent transmission. Why, if I'm not concerned about not surviving COVID, why would I care if I get a vaccine or not?
Great question. That is not an entirely true statement. Right now, Omicron definitely has crossed a boundary, and the effectiveness of Moderna and Pfizer is not as high as it was for Delta. No question about it. But that's not to say that 30% of the people who've gotten the vaccine will not get the virus at all. Of the 70%, a lot of them will be asymptomatic. And that's actually wonderful, because the bottom line with a virus is it ought to travel all the way around the world. And that way, it will do what vaccines do, which, unlike what that famous scientist said, Omicron is the weak sister of Delta and Alpha. And that's a good thing. That virus is looking to survive and not put itself out of business and not make us so damn sick that it kills us. And that's what viruses tend to do over time. And that's what Omicron has done. So it's done exactly the opposite of what that guy with the very complicated name said it would do, which is what happens in science all the time. We're constantly making up new stories and finding out that we're right or wrong, or we're right for a while and wrong for the long term. That's the way it is. So you're a healthy young man, right? And I know people your age who have died from COVID. And if you want to take that risk, great. Come along with me and jump out of helicopters.
So I've got a very different question. I'm very for the vaccine because I could consent to it. So how do you convince a Biden supporter that the mandate is wrong? A reasonable Biden supporter that would listen to an argument.
Oh my God, not politics.
Well, I mean, that the
Yeah.
vaccine is just
Look-
it's political now.
Like,
That's what it's become.
look what just happened with the Supreme Court, right? Three people sitting on the Supreme Court that don't even believe in the Constitution of the United States said the mandate should hold because it's a public safety issue. And 6 people who are demonized from being conservative said, gee, the Constitution doesn't allow an extension of power to a government agency like that, right? And that's the world we're living in, right? Let's get over it, right? That's the way it goes. So how do you convince the Biden administration that they're not completely Looney Tunes? As far as I'm concerned, the left is suffering complete biases, and so is the right. And here we are, we're libertarians, and we have the right answers.
Last question.
Pretty quick. What is your recommendation in summary? Would you say the vast majority of people should get vaccinated, or what would you recommend for the COVID one?
I would say yes. I would say yes. Not that it's perfect. Not that it might not have side effects. Not that it may be the most effective vaccine. I just got another shingles vaccine last week because the first one that I got, 15, 20 years ago, turns out wasn't effective. It happens in medicine and science. That's the way it goes. And I've seen people who got shingles, and it's something I would like to avoid. So I got myself another shot in the arm, and I'm going to have to get a second one before it's done. And that's my decision. As a libertarian, that I've seen what shingles can do to somebody, and I'm 76 years old. I do not want to break with shingles. So I get another hole in my arm.
You got time for one more question while the mic lasts?
Sure.
Okay, actual last question.
No, keep going. I don't care.
You can ask him questions in private.
No, you're not making another speech there. No, you're not.
So one of the things you mentioned was don't listen to people with anecdotes. I think that's basically what you said. I heard a lot of anecdotes, a lot of stories. I heard some numbers. I didn't hear very many facts or data references. Can you reference any studies, or what made you decide, if you read a study that made you decide to go take this vaccine? Can you throw any of that stuff out there for the audience, please? Specific study.
I can't, actually, even though I've read hundreds of them. I'm not very good at that. But every one that Leif has, every countercultural one that Leif has sent me, I've read every single word of it, including the Bayesian analysis, which is complete bad probability theory. So, there we go. We got a place to start. But no, just I've watched the data, and the worldwide data sucks. Right now, according to worldwide data, there have been 328 million cases of COVID out of 7.5 billion people. That's complete rubbish. Just look at the infection in India, for instance, before they had the vaccine. And you knew that a lot more people had been infected with COVID, but nobody's going around to little villages in central India with blood tests, right? So they're not being tested. So the real numbers, we don't know. I agree with all of that. There's a lot of unknowns here. But for me, I'm 76 years old, right? I've got plenty of disorders, and I figured that that's cheap protection for me, right? Because I've watched old people die. Is it comorbidity? So what? I mean, really, so what? Did they die from COVID or did they die? Look, my son had pancreatic cancer, and on his death certificate, it said he's died from swallowing vomitus. The data sucks. Theirs data sucks because it comes off of death certificates. It sucks. And I know this anecdotally, so that doesn't count for very much, right? But you go and look at anybody's death certificate, and they almost never die from what they really died from on a death certificate. So data's being collected that really, really sucks. So how do we protect ourselves? Well, that's my story. For most of my life, I have put myself in harm's way, and so I've done everything I could to help understand the situation I was going to be in and protect myself, and that includes things like viruses and things like medical kits.
All right, that's our talk. Give it up for Ed Warner. Thanks everybody for coming out. We'll be back in 2 weeks. It sounds like we might have to do the opposite inverse of this talk as well, since there seemed to be a lot of interest. But yeah, we'll be back in 2 weeks. Matthias von Gutenberg will be speaking on Austrian economics. So hope to see everyone in 2 weeks. Drive safe. The roads are slippery. Thanks for coming out. Have a good night and keep fighting the state.